As I mentioned, Nathan was supposed to preach tonight, but he's sick, so be in prayer for Nathan. But trust the Lord will bless tonight as we consider his word. Matthew chapter 5, and let's just read from verse 10 this evening. It says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." And let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we thank you once again for the opportunity we have to come and to meet in this place and to spend time together as a body of believers and to spend time considering the truths of your word. And Lord, I pray that this evening as we continue our study in the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, you bless our time. Lord, give me wisdom and guidance as I speak. Lord, it would be your words, it would be your thoughts. Lord, I pray that we'd gain a greater understanding this evening of your word and leave being refreshed and blessed through your word. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. In our study of the Beatitudes, we come now to verse 10. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You know, the first 7 Beatitudes that we looked at concentrated on the inward condition of the godly. Okay, they're all about how we are to behave and to conduct ourselves as believers, and it stems from a change in our attitudes. Okay, a change of the attitude, which will then result in a difference or a change in the way we act, the way we live, the way we conduct ourselves as believers. Okay, and that's what the first 7 were really concentrated on. It's on that inward change. These last 2 statements here in verses 10 through to verse 12 concentrate now on the outward circumstances of the godly. Basically, what we see here are the results of being godly. The results of being godly, or how we can expect the world to now treat us if we have the Beatitudes evident in our lives. If those first 7 are found in us, then we can expect the world to treat us like this. This is how we can expect them to treat us for our holy conduct. Okay, and the answer, of course, is persecution. You know, there is a brand of Christianity today that seems very unlike what Christ is describing here, which is it's completely different to what Christ is talking about. This is a brand of Christianity that's easygoing. It's popular. It's a popular kind of religion because it's acceptable with the world because there's no conviction of sin and there's no taking up your cross to follow Christ. And so it's an easygoing religion and it's accepted by many. The world has no problem with accepting and following a religion that permits them to stay in their sins. Come as you are, stay as you are. The world's quite happy with that. The world will actively stand against one that preaches against sin and preaches righteousness. That's just a natural result. You see, the point is we cannot hope to reflect the attitudes of Christ, the Beatitudes here, and avoid persecution. You can't do it. We can't hope to have the attitudes of Christ evident in our lives and avoid being persecuted for it. They go hand in hand. The natural result of living godly in this world is persecution by the ungodly. And this has always been the case right throughout history. Now, Wearsby, in his commentary, he said this: the righteous have always suffered for their faith in one way or another. It began with Abel being killed by Cain. Moses chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to compromise in Egypt. Jesus himself told us that the prophets were persecuted, and he warned his disciples that they too would be persecuted. The book of Acts and all of church history since has verified our Lord's prediction. You see, the point is, it's always been the case. Righteousness goes together with persecution, with suffering. It started with Abel. He was persecuted by his brother. You got Moses being persecuted. You got the prophets. You got the disciples, the apostles. And then right throughout church history, we have righteousness being persecuted. And so persecution naturally follows holy conduct. And many put these last 2 statements into one beatitude. And there's a logical reason they do that. That's because both are speaking about the same subject. Both are talking about persecution. But we're going to look at them as two separate beatitudes, just simply because there's 3 verses here and it's 2 statements of blessed are. And so we're going to look at them as 2 separate ones. Okay. And while the 2 blessed statements here are both about persecution, there are some differences between the 2. In verse 10, basically what we see is persecution described in general terms. Okay, verse 10 says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And so it's talking about persecution in general terms. But then in verses 11 through to 12, we have described for us a specific kind of persecution. Okay, it says in verse 11, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." So verse 11 in particular describes verbal attacks, doesn't it? Okay, it's verbal persecution. And so there is a slight difference between verse 10 and what's talked about in verse 11. We also notice that in verse 10, the ones persecuted are referred to as they. Blessed are they which are persecuted. While in verse 11, it refers to them as ye. Blessed are ye. Okay, so there are some slight differences here between the 2, although they're both talking about the overall topic of persecution. So we're going to begin this evening by looking at verse 10, and we're going to spend a couple of weeks talking about verse 10, and then we'll move on and talk about verse 11 and 12. We want to focus our attention this evening simply on the character of persecution. Okay, the character of persecution, and we want to do that by looking simply at the word that's translated persecuted here in verse 10. It says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake." We want to look at that word persecuted. Firstly, this evening we see that persecution is an aggressive pursuit. Persecution is an aggressive pursuit. You see, the word translated persecuted here literally means to pursue or to follow after. That's what the word is talking about, to pursue or follow after. Lawler describes it as meaning to drive or chase away. And he says it's used to express flight, pursuit in a hostile manner, harassment, or driving someone away. Okay, and so that's what this word is talking about. It's this idea of pursuing, following after in a hostile manner, okay, harassing them. And so we see that persecution, first of all, one of the characteristics of it is that it is an aggressive pursuit of the righteous. That's what persecution is. We see this in the life of the Apostle Paul before he got saved, don't we? Okay, before Paul got saved, this is exactly what he was doing. He was aggressively pursuing after the righteous, after the church, after Christians. He was on his way to Damascus to do that very thing, wasn't he, when he met the Lord? Okay, he was on his way to Damascus to pursue the believers and bring them bound back to Jerusalem. Let's just turn over to Acts chapter 9. Look at a few verses here. Now we've been looking at Acts on Sunday morning, so it all sort of ties together. In Acts chapter 9 and just verse 1, it says, "And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went unto the high priest and desired of him letters to Damascus to the synagogues, that if he found any of this way, whether they were men or women, he might bring them bound unto Jerusalem." Okay, and so we see him aggressively pursuing after them to Damascus. You see, he wasn't just content to see the church in Jerusalem scattered. Okay, and that was the result of the persecution, wasn't it? Back in Acts chapter 8 and verse 3, we read that Paul has already caused havoc there. Chapter 8, verse 3, it says, "As for Paul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house and hailing men and women, committed them to prison." Okay, so he's already caused havoc in Jerusalem. He's caused problems there to the point where the church at Jerusalem has been scattered. They've gone forth, spread out into various different locations to get away from that persecution. Paul wasn't content with that, was he? He didn't stop as soon as he saw the church scattered. Okay, Paul, or Saul, I should say, before he got saved, was so enraged by his passion against Christ, against the church, that he pursued after the believers to Damascus and to other locations, seeking to bring them back to Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 26 and verse 11, Paul himself said, and being exceeding mad against them, I persecuted them even unto strange cities. Okay. Again, he's talking about the fact that he pursued after them aggressively. And so we see this idea of aggressive pursuit in the life of the Apostle Paul, don't we? Before he was saved, before Christ changed him. After Paul gets saved, we see the same thing happen to him, don't we? Okay, once Paul is saved and he's traveling around on his missionary journeys, as we've been looking at on Sunday mornings, as he's traveling around, Paul himself experiences this same idea, being aggressively pursued. If you remember on Sunday morning, we read about how Paul was stoned, okay, and left for dead at the city of Lystra. But if you notice, it wasn't the people in Lystra who stirred up the problem. It was Jews who had followed him from Antioch and Iconium. Just go to Acts chapter 14 and verse 19, which we read on Sunday. We'll read it again. It says, "And there came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium, persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead." Okay, so you've got these Jews who actively pursued after him, didn't they? They followed him from Antioch and Iconium to Lystra and stirred up the people against him. The same thing happened again in Acts chapter 17, verse 13. This time it's the Jews from Thessalonica. Acts chapter 17, verse 13, it says, "But when the Jews of Thessalonica had knowledge that the word of God was preached of Paul at Berea, they came thither also and stirred up the people." Okay, we could look at various other times this happened. But persecution followed Paul, didn't it? They pursued after him. His persecutors chased him. And so once again, it's clear that that persecution involves this idea of aggressive pursuit, doesn't it? Aggressive pursuit after the righteous. Even in the Old Testament, we see an example of this kind of persecution in King Ahab. King Ahab, we know that was probably the worst king that Israel had. Okay, and he aggressively pursued after the prophets of God, didn't he? In particular, the prophet Elijah. In 1 Kings 18 and verse 10, we see one of Ahab's servants says this to Elijah. He says, "There is no nation or kingdom whither my Lord hath not sent to seek thee." Okay, the point is Ahab was looking for him everywhere, wasn't he? Okay, he's searching for Elijah everywhere he could possibly look. Why? He wasn't looking for him to get wise counsel. He was looking for him to put him to death. So again, even in the Old Testament, we have Ahab aggressively pursuing the righteous. And the point here is that, you see, those who are persecutors, those who persecute the righteous, they're not passively waiting for believers to pass by before they persecute them. Rather, they're actively and aggressively pursuing after believers. That is the characteristic of persecution and those who are persecuting. They actively pursue after. When we look through church history, we see that this is the characteristic of persecution, don't we? Right throughout every age. We see it with the Roman Catholic Church. We see it in the communist countries. It was aggressive pursuit of the righteous. Lawler, again, he said this: "We may call upon the witness of the past and refer to the terrible persecutions of Christians during the history of the church in all ages, particularly the Smyrna period, AD 100 to 300, when believers were pursued from place to place, hunted down like beasts, and put to death." So persecution involves, first of all, this idea of aggressive pursuit. Anytime you see the church being heavily persecuted, this is what's happening. Okay, it's not just they're idly sitting by and waiting for them to come by. They're going after them. That's what persecution implies. I was thinking about even today, the church is still aggressively pursued. The Christian faith is still aggressively pursued by those who are against it. They aggressively push to silence us, don't they? They push to go against the faith, to go against the truth, to make sure we have no say, to make sure we can't practice the way we want to. And more that's happening. It's an aggressive pursuit, seeking to chase the righteous away and to silence them. So persecution, first of all, is an aggressive pursuit. Secondly, here, we see that persecution involves cruelty. Still talking about that word persecuted. It involves cruelty. So not only does that word there, translated persecuted, speak about aggressive pursuit, it also speaks about cruelty or causing injury to someone. Lawler, again, he states that the meaning of the Greek word also includes molestation, injury, or to treat evilly. Okay, it's molestation, injury, or to treat evilly. So persecution, and it's not something new, is it? Naturally involves cruelty towards believers. Now, we've already alluded to this when we looked at Paul before his salvation. He was aggressively pursuing to do what? To cruelly entreat the believers. He was seeking to bring them back to do what? To have them flogged or to have them put to death. That's what he was trying to do. And Paul himself suffered cruelty at the hand of persecution, didn't he? He speaks about many things that he suffered in 2 Corinthians. Let's turn over there. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Excuse me. 2 Corinthians 11, verse 23 says, "Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors more abundant, in stripes above measure, in prisons more frequent, in deaths oft. Of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once I was stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck, night and a day I've been in the deep." He speaks about here the things that he's suffered at the hands of others. He's been persecuted cruelly. He speaks about being whipped, about being stoned, about being beaten. And on Sunday morning in Acts chapter 21, we saw Paul being beaten, didn't we? One of these occasions he's speaking about here, being beaten by the mob to almost death until the Romans intervened and saved his life. And so Paul knew what it meant, not only to be aggressively pursued, but to also be cruelly treated because of his faith. Hebrews chapter 11, we read of many others who suffered cruelly for their faith, don't we? Let's turn over there, Hebrews 11. In Hebrews 11, verse 33, it says, "Who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and in caves of the earth." So here in Hebrews 11, again, we see the same idea. Persecution is associated with this cruelty. We see mentioned here imprisonment, beatings, other acts of cruelty against men and women of God, men and women of faith. Outside of the Bible, we only have to read a book like Fox's Book of Martyrs, don't we, to see the long list of atrocities committed against believers, the righteous, since the time of Christ. And even today we hear reports from around the world of cruel persecution, don't we, of believers in other countries. And so persecution always involves not only an aggressive pursuit, but also involves cruelty of some form. Often it is in the form of physical violence. It can also be in the form of words, can't it? It can be in the form of words, which is what verse 11 highlights. And when we get there, we'll look at it closely. But verse 11 of Matthew chapter 5 says that. It says, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake." So that cruelty can come in the form of words. Words do hurt, don't they? They do cause us great affliction at times. So that cruelty can come from the mouth of someone else as well. For now in this country, it's true that the cruelty we face is often spoken, isn't it? It's often words. But that seems to be changing more and more, doesn't it? More and more we're getting close to the point where we may have to stand up for our faith, and we may indeed suffer violence because we're standing up for the faith. We're heading in that direction, aren't we? Persecution involves cruelty. And then thirdly and lastly, we see that persecution is relentless. It's relentless. It's an aggressive pursuit. It involves cruelty, and it is relentless. This word persecuted here reveals to us this one last characteristic, and that is that it is persistent. or it is relentless. You see, the Greek word here in our verse is in the perfect tense, which describes a past action with a continuous result, okay, or an ongoing felt result. Okay? It's continually felt in the presence. The emphasis for us is on the fact that this persecution is persistent, it's ongoing. It hasn't stopped, it's unrelenting. It doesn't just deliver one blow and then quits. Rather, it continues to deliver blow upon blow upon blow. It's something that continues right throughout all ages. Now, this helps us to understand a passage in the book of Daniel, which applies to the Antichrist, but it also gives us a principle, if you like, for persecution through every age. Just go over there to Daniel with me. Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7, and just the start of verse 25 there. Daniel 7, verse 25, it says, "And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High." Talking about Antichrist here, and the fact that he will wear out, he's going to speak great words against the Most High, and then it says that he will wear out the saints of the Most High. You know, yes, like I said, it is talking about the Antichrist, it is talking about the end times, but there's a principle there throughout all ages of how the devil persecutes the church. You see, the devil is unrelenting in his persecution. He's seeking to wear out the saints of God. One commentator said this, he said, to wear out the saints means to harass them continually so that life becomes a wretched existence. That's Satan's goal, to harass the believer, the righteous, continuously so that they get to the point where they've had enough, so that life becomes a wretched existence. And indeed, you know, the devil throughout all ages has sought in one form or another to relentlessly persecute the church, and his goal is to wear out believers. That is what he wants to do. And he will continue to do so until Christ comes again. He's trying his very best to make life miserable for us as believers, as the righteous. You know, the reality is that, as verse 10 back in Matthew chapter 5 says, "Blessed are they which are persecuted." It's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Blessed. Christ says, blessed. He says, happy. You're blessed. You see, to be persecuted for Christ is a blessed thing. Satan's trying to wear us out, sure. But Christ says we're blessed. And Christ is with us through it all, isn't he? You know, persecution means that Christ is right there by our side. Doesn't mean he's forsaken us. He's actually there with us. We're suffering because of Christ, as we'll see as we continue our study in Matthew 5. We're suffering for righteousness' sake. We're suffering for his name's sake. And so it is a blessed thing to be counted worthy of partaking in his sufferings. It's a wonderful privilege. Now, 1 Peter 3 and verse 14, we read, it says, "And if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye." That was what Peter said. Peter said, we're happy. Happy are ye if you're suffering for righteousness' sake. You know, tonight we've basically just considered the characteristics of persecution. And we've seen that it is a relentless, cruel, aggressive pursuit of the righteous. That's what persecution is. A relentless, cruel, aggressive pursuit of the righteous. And we're going to go on next time to look at the cause of that persecution, which of course is righteousness. And we'll expound upon that more next time. Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Lord and Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word. And Lord, there's so much in just one little word here in this verse. Lord, as we consider what persecution really is, this relentless, cruel, aggressive pursuit of the righteous. But Lord, as your word says, blessed are they which are persecuted. Lord, help us to remember that, Lord, if we are going through persecution, Lord, it's a blessed state to be in. Because, Lord, you're right there beside us, and Lord, we're suffering for your name's sake. And Lord, help us just to continue forward in your strength and not allow the devil to wear us out as he seeks to do. And Lord, may you bless now as we close in Jesus' name.